Well, welcome to this Wiley Rhine podcast. My name is Rick O'Keefe from the Government Contracts Practice Group at Wiley Rhine. Wiley Rhine, a DC-based firm that stands at the intersection of law and policy. Today, joining me on this podcast are my partners, Scott Felder and Rob Walker, and we're here today to talk about, at a very high level, some practical considerations in managing the risk of recruiting, hiring, and employing former government employees by government contractors primarily. And we will also handle a couple of other related issues beyond the high-level risk management that we want to talk about, especially with Rob and Scott. Let me just start by introducing myself. I'm Rick O'Keefe. I'm a partner in the Government Contracts Practice Group. I've been with Wiley since 2005, and before that, I was an Army Judge Advocate for 21 years, during which I had a number of tours in which I was a DoD ethics counselor. Scott, over to you.
Thanks, Rick. It's really great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. My name's Scott Felder. I'm a partner in the Government Contracts Group, and while it may seem unusual for somebody whose practice generally centers around intellectual property and government contracts to be joining a podcast on post-government employment restrictions, I have a second hat that I wear from time to time, and that is as an Army Reserve Judge Advocate. And in that role, I am a designated ethics counselor for my unit. So I have often seen these issues from the other side of the table on behalf of my commanders and my fellow soldiers. Rob?
Thanks, Scott and Rick. I'm Rob Walker. I'm of counsel in Wiley's Election Law and Government Ethics Practice Group. Been at Wiley since 2008. A significant part of my practice is advising organizations and individuals, both inside the government and outside the government, on federal ethics matters, including post-employment restrictions and the subjects we're going to talk about today. Before coming to Wiley, I had been a prosecutor with the Department of Justice, including as a trial attorney with the Public Integrity Section. And then after that, I was chief counsel and staff director of both the House Ethics Committee and then the Senate Ethics Committee. I think back to you, Rick.
Thank you. So let me just set the stage for our discussion today. And we're talking about the infamous revolving door between private industry and the government. And there's a certain amount of disreputability when you use the term revolving door. But face it, people in the government gain valuable training, education, experience. They bring a lot to the table. There are a lot of reasons why a lot of government employees can add significant value to any company that's lucky enough to recruit them, hire them, and use them. But while we're not going to go into any great detail today about the big rules that govern and regulate that kind of back and forth between the government and industry, we need to start by understanding that the major statutes and regulations place significant limitations on what a government employee can do when hunting for a job in private industry, what a company seeking to employ a government official can do by way of recruiting, and once the person becomes a part of a company, what can be done after they've been hired. And we're primarily going to be focusing on fairly high-level officials, the risks that come with hiring very senior government personnel. But frankly, the same principles that work for an undersecretary or a three-star general, those same principles are applicable if you're thinking about hiring a GS-11 or a captain getting out of the Army, for example. And while you would love to be able to do a perfect job putting into effect some of the things we'll talk about here today, some of the best practices that we'll talk about here today, every time, we do understand that risks are different depending on who it is you're thinking about hiring, and companies have to husband their resources and apply them judiciously, and you're not going to spend the same amount of time and trouble necessarily with all government personnel that you're recruiting and using. But again, the lessons learned and the things we'll talk about apply all up and down the chain. It all focuses on, at the center of all this, is the person that you're thinking about hiring. At some point, the company has decided, hey, we've dealt with this person in this or that setting. We believe that with what we want to do going forward, this person can bring value to our business plan, and we think that it would be a good fit, right? So you've got that person at the very center of the problem, or the solution rather. But think of it as a hub and spokes. You got the recruit at the center in the hub, and you've got, on the one hand, at the company that is considering hiring him, you've got HR, you've got the program office or shop that wants that person, and you've got legal. And on the government side, you've got the supervisory chain of command of the person you're thinking about hiring, and you've got the legal function, the ethics counselor on the government. So you've got all these spokes coming out, emanating from the person that's being hired. And without a team effort, you can't maximize the protection that you can get from doing it right. Because, again, the revolving door does involve some public mistrust. The idea of folks going back and forth from industry to government and back again, it has to be handled well in order to avoid the appearance of impropriety or actual impropriety. Without working together, you can't protect everyone as well as you need to. And it's also important when you're thinking about, especially hiring someone who's quite senior, that there are certain personal and psychological factors that are at work that need to be taken into account as you're trying to do it right. So if you're thinking about hiring, let's say a 4-star general, you need to understand a couple things about that person. Number one, that person is used to people telling him yes or her yes all the time and not hearing no a lot. Well, that kind of a dynamic can interfere with the kind of candid and full communication and consideration of all factors that is necessary to getting a good, and Scott will talk about it in a minute, good ethics opinion. Because it's the ethics opinion, usually embodied in a letter, that encapsulates all the factors that bear on the propriety of what it is you're trying to do and what you can do going forward. And if the communication flow is affected by the fact that this is a 4-star general, I don't want to say no, I don't want to ask these tough questions, that can lead to a problem. Also understand that especially for a retiring 4-star general, for example, it's a big life-changing event. It's the kind of thing that no matter how important you have been for the last number of years as a general officer, you're going into a different world. It can be scary. And it's important to understand that dynamic when you're dealing with the person at the hub of all this effort, being sensitive to that and acting accordingly to get the best information. There are also folks at this level, and at any level of authority, is that people like that are often big picture folks. They won't necessarily have the granular recollection or knowledge that is necessary to getting a good ethics opinion. And therefore, you need to, when you're dealing with that person, you need to be sensitive to that and understanding all the other things we've talked about, engaging with that person in a way that's designed to take all those factors into account and get out the information you need. And then finally, kind of flipping over to the company's hired 4-star general, and the general, because of various things that he or she did while in the service, on what he or she can and cannot do and communicate with the government about. Well, that can run up against a problem in that, okay, this general is now working for a company and is naturally, because remember, they're a little anxious, big life-changing event, retirement has occurred. They don't want to say no Now they don't want to say no. They want to show that, hey, I'm worth every penny that you're paying me. I add value. It was a good decision when you decided to hire me. And they want to show their stuff. That can put pressure on the new employer to perhaps go too close to the line on respecting limitations that that officer brings with him or her to the company. So, by way of setting the stage, we, Wiley, typically look at these recruiting actions as a problem to be tackled by understanding all of the things that are going on with the person that you're dealing with, the company that wants to hire, the government officials on the other side, and everyone working together to protect everyone. The government's reputation and the integrity of government processes are preserved. The company's reputation is protected. And most of all, the person who is really on the hook if there's a violation of law or regulation is protected as well. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to Scott, who can add a little bit more to that based on his current practice, but perhaps more importantly, his experience as an ethics counselor.
Thanks, Rick. And you raised a lot of really good points about the relationship between the ethics counselor or the judge advocate and their senior leadership, or even their more junior soldiers or service members. While some of those considerations loom large when you're talking about, as you said, a very senior officer who's not used to hearing no, you've also pointed out that this does apply throughout all ranks. And I think the process here of getting that good, solid ethics opinion in place for your departing service member starts well before they show up in your office and say, hey, I need this ethics opinion, or I need a letter for my post-government employment. Because one of the things you don't want to do in that ethics counselor role is get the reputation as the no shop. The idea that senior leaders say, well, every time I go to the lawyers, they tell me no. It's really important that they look at you as facilitators, people that are there to help them achieve what their mission is in a legal way. It will make them more receptive to the ethics advice you give them as they're leaving. That, I think, really is important, more so with the more senior officers and leadership. When you start looking at the more junior soldiers, who, again, might need ethics opinions when they're going, if you've got some very experienced non-commissioned officer, for example, that has a lot of special forces experience or a lot of intel community experience going to an intel contractor, it happens very often, their perception of the judge advocate's office is a little bit different. Their perception of the judge advocate's office very much or very often is, these are the guys that show up when I get in trouble. And so I don't want to go talk to them. You need to make sure you have that relationship in place. That really is the first piece of being able to give a solid ethics opinion when you have somebody asking a question about their post-government employment. The next part of it, and this is really where the rubber meets the road, is how do we get all the information, all the details, all the facts and specifics that we need to be able to render that solid opinion that you've just described. And like so much else in the DoD, we have a form for that. We have the DD 2945, and that's my starting point whenever I'm faced with one of these issues is, sir or ma'am or sergeant or captain or whatever, where's your 2945 so I can at least get a head start on the questions that I'm going to end up asking you. And most of the time I'm following up. Most of the time I'm picking up the phone and I'm setting up a call or an interview with the soldier to ask, hey, what is it you're going to go do? Do you understand this limitation? Do you understand that limitation? Does your prospective employer understand the restrictions that are going to be imposed on you? Have they acknowledged them? Because as you've said, Rick, we don't want the individual service member getting in trouble. They don't want their employer getting in trouble. I like your hub and spoke analogy. It's one that I hadn't heard before, but it really captures the interplay and the relationships here to avoid not just the actual conflict, but the perception, the perceived conflict, which is oftentimes as harmful as the actual conflict at the end of the day. And I know you've had some recent experience. I've certainly worked closely with outside counsel in my role as ethics counselor, getting folks squared away. I think you've done that as well.
I have, Scott, but first let me just say that your take on the relationship you need to have with your client base is spot on. Without that, nothing can work. But yes, again, understanding that you can't do this with everyone. You don't need to do this with everyone. The model that I would offer up as the ideal, and it's really probably only really necessary on a very high risk, high visibility recruitment, is a case that handled in the last year and a half or so involving a three-star general. I won't say which service or anything else like that, but I will say that the general was smart enough, and the client that engaged us to help with this was smart enough to start the planning 6 months before the officer was set to retire after 33 years. Okay? They came to us and said, we want this to be done. We want it to be done right. And so we were able to go in and sit down with the officer and get information, basically start to fill out the 2945, which, by the way, just so everyone knows, at that level in DOD, you got to have an ethics opinion. It's a mandatory thing. But we were able to sit down and fill that out and make contact with the ethics counselor that serviced the general. And fortunately, on that end, the reception it can vary, but any good ethics counselor should be willing to work with you because their interest is in protecting the command that they serve, and that can best be done by getting really good facts, really solid facts, and issuing a really good opinion. And so we were able to do that. We reached out to the ethics counselor. He was willing to work with us. We shared a draft of the 2945. He asked some questions. He met, obviously, with the officer himself, understanding, of course, that, as probably most of you all know, there is no attorney-client relationship between the ethics counselor and the person getting the opinion letter. But nevertheless, they met. There was a back and forth, and we finalized the 2945 in conjunction with the ethics counselor. The ethics counselor then shared a draft of the ethics opinion letter with us. There were a few things that we thought could be clarified. There was one or two issues that we thought would be well to be addressed that weren't in the letter. In fact, as Rob will talk about in a little while, there was a Section 1045 issue that we thought could be addressed. But bottom line is we were working with him all the way through. So when we were done, we had a letter that was rock solid based on good facts with very specific and complete advice. And then once the hire went through on our end, we were able to work with and in fact, actually, there was, as the ethics letter was going on, we helped to draft the job description. We had input to the job description of our client to meld aspects or features that would mitigate ethics risk into the job description. And when we were done, we had a good job description, we had a good ethics letter, and everyone sat down after the hire occurred within our client's organization. HR, legal, and the person the officer was working for, the general was working for, and we went over, all right, here are the ground rules. Here's what you do in these situations. Let me know if you have any further issues. Go forth and do great things. So that was the absolute ideal. Generally, you get less than that, but if you can shoot for that, especially when you've assessed a particular recruitment action as elevated risk, everyone is better protected.
Hey, Rick, I do have a question for you. And it does sound like that was a really smooth, kind of seamless operation or effort there. And you mentioned that that's the ideal. But is it fair to say that in your experience, if you reach out and at least try to engage in dialogue in some constructive process with respect to an ethics letter, you usually can achieve something, can get something more than just a template letter out of the process? Has that been your experience?
I've never had a bad experience reaching out. Sometimes the ethics counselor well, most of the time they won't work this closely, but they'll listen. I've never found an ethics counselor who wasn't at least ready to listen. And so, yes, I don't see any possible downside, or at least I haven't.
I suspect being Colonel retired O'Keefe might help in that regard a little bit. Not a bad card to play if you've got it, right?
I have been known to play that card before, hopefully not too heavy-handedly. Well, thanks, Scott and Rob, for all that. It seems like we've gone a little longer than expected, but we've got so much more to talk about. But we want to try and keep individual podcasts to a manageable time. We're going to go ahead and sign off now, but we'll be back with part 2. So please look forward to that. Thank you very much, guys.